You know your department is underwater when the biggest operational strategy becomes just make it to the summer. Not innovation, not modernization, not transformation, survival. And that's the thing about K-12 technology operations. Most districts don't wake up one morning and decide to build an environment dependent upon heroics. It happens gradually, one emergency at a time, one workaround at a time, one budget cut at a time, one, we'll figure it out at a time. Eventually, you look around and realize the environment is running because a handful of dedicated people are carrying out extraordinary amounts of operational responsibility. Systems work, classrooms function, testing gets completed, the phones ring, and the wireless stays online. And because everything appears to be working, leadership assumes the operating model is healthy. But is it? Or is the organization simply benefiting from extraordinary people compensating for ordinary problems? Today we're talking about heroics, not the good kind, the dangerous kind. The kind that hides risk, the kind that hides technical debt, the kind that makes organizations believe everything is fine, right up until it isn't. Welcome to Chips and Chalk. Real talk, hard lessons, K-12 technology behind the scenes. Welcome to Chips and Chalk, where we talk real K-12 technology. Not the sales pitch, not the conference version, what actually works in schools. I'm your host, Adam Swinchock, and I've spent a career leading technology K-12 environments. And if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that the gap between what is promised and what actually happens in a school district is massive. This podcast is about closing that gap. Every one of my tech directors or CTOs know exactly what I'm talking about right now. Every district has one, maybe several. The technology superhero. The person who remembers every password. The person who knows every system. The person can troubleshoot anything. The person everyone calls when nobody else can figure it out. The person answering emails at night. The person who always says yes. The person who somehow keeps everything moving. People love superheroes. You know, we've made enough movies about them. Teachers love them. Administrators love them. Other technology staff rely on them. Communities appreciate them, and to be fair, these people are incredibly valuable. But there's an uncomfortable truth associated with that. If your technology operation depends on superheroes, your organization is probably less healthy than you think. Because these superheroes create the illusion that the system is sustainable. The district sees successful testing sessions, working devices, projects completed, outages avoided, and classroom functioning. What they don't see is your skipped lunch, the late nights, the undocumented fixes, the manual workarounds, the constant context switching, the stress, the exhaustion, and eventually burnout. And eventually that superhero becomes the system. That's the danger. Because mature organizations are not built around people. They're built around systems. They're built around documentation, redundancy, cross-training people, processes, life cycle planning, and sustainable operational capacity. A superhero culture sounds admirable, and Lord knows I've been in enough of them. Operationally, it's a warning sign, because what happens when that superhero retires, or gets sick, or goes on vacation? What happens if they resign? What happens when they eventually burn out? What happens when they simply decide they're tired? Suddenly, leadership discovers how much organizational risk was sitting inside one person's head. And here's another uncomfortable reality. Many superheroes unintentionally contribute to that problem. Not because they're bad at their jobs, because they care. And they keep saying yes, and they keep compensating. And they keep fixing things quietly. They keep protecting classrooms from operational reality. But every time heroics compensates for structural problems, leadership visibility decreases. The organization sees success. The organization doesn't see the risk. until one day that hero isn't there. And when that hero isn't there, for a day, for a week, for a month, we call that technical debt. Now, let's pause for a moment and talk about technical debt. Now, for my superintendents listening, or even my business managers, and maybe even some of our technical directors out there, let's pause for a moment and talk about technical debt, because this term gets thrown around constantly. Now, technical debt is what happens when technology teams choose the quick fix instead of the proper long-term solution because there isn't enough time, staffing, or budget to do it correctly. Think of it like deferred maintenance. You can postpone replacing the roof. You can patch the HVAC system for another year. You can ignore the cracks in the parking lot for a while. But eventually, repairs become more expensive, failures become more frequent, and emergencies become more disruptive. Technology works the exact same way. Technical debt looks like servers beyond life cycle, unsupported software, aging devices stretched one more year, temporary fixes that become permanent, inconsistent security settings, undocumented systems, and manual processes that should have been automated years ago. And all this sounds like someone isn't doing their job. But before we start pointing fingers, what I want you to do is actually step back and think about something. Technical debt usually isn't caused by laziness. It's caused by operational overload. Technology teams become so busy keeping the schools running today that they lose the capacity to prepare for tomorrow entirely. And eventually the district starts paying interest on that debt through outages, cybersecurity exposures, slower support, instabilities, staff burnout, and emergency replacement costs, which are really detrimental to K-12 school districts' budgets. And that's why mature technology organizations need time not to just react, they need time to improve, to document, to standardize, to modernize, and to prevent problems before they become incidents. And that's one of the biggest problems I've seen in my 20 plus years working in IT departments. They're not just technology departments anymore. They're operational departments. Think about everything that falls into IT today. Cybersecurity, student devices, teacher devices, wireless, internet, phones, security cameras, door access systems, identity management, single sign-on, learning management, student information, data privacy, state reporting, backups, disaster recovery, AI governance, filtering, vendor management, compliance, and increasingly, parent expectations. 20 years ago, if something broke, people just waited. Today, we've created concierge-level service expectations. Parents expect immediate communications. Teachers expect immediate support. Administrators expect dashboards. Boards expect cybersecurity maturity. Vendors expect rapid implementations. Everybody expects technology to work all the time. Meanwhile, many districts are operating with staffing structures designed for an era of computer labs or shared carts, if that. The responsibilities have evolved. The staffing models didn't. And that disconnect creates pressure. Lots of pressure. And the question nobody likes asking, especially superintendents, business managers, and board members, because the answer is usually not what they want, what is actually an appropriate staffing level for a modern K-12 technology program? And the answer is really frustrating usually, because it depends. Every district is different. But here's what we do know. Many districts benchmark against neighboring districts or ones that are similar size. That's really dangerous, because if everyone around you is struggling and they're not really admitting it because they want to, keep up the facade that everything is working perfectly, you're not benchmarking success. You're benchmarking exhaustion. So let's use a practical example. A district with 4,000 students, 300 staff members, let's say 5 schools, 2 admin buildings, all within, 10 miles of each other. Many leaders hear 10 miles and think, well, that's not very large. But geography doesn't reduce complexity. The network still exists. Devices still break. Systems still fail. The tickets still arrive. The users still need support. And a modern environment that size can easily contain 5,000 to 7,000 managed endpoints. Instructional technology, access control, cameras, VoIP, cybersecurity tooling, testing infrastructure, dozens and dozens of SaaS integrations, identity platforms, backup systems, and compliance obligations. Operationally, that's not a small environment. A healthy staffing model might include a director or a CTO, infrastructure manager, a network administrator, someone for security responsibilities, 6 to 8 support technicians, and potentially someone that runs the SIS or the instructional technology support part of it. 7 to 10 tech professionals isn't unreasonable for an environment that size, yet many districts operate with substantially less. And somehow they survive, which creates another illusion. Leadership sees survival, technology leaders see risk, and both observations are technically correct. And it ends up leading to a hidden cost of understaffing. It's called burnout, and it gets all the attention, but burnout isn't usually the first symptom. It's one of the last. The real damage happens quietly and daily, because when capacity disappears, important work stops happening. Documentation needs to happen, lifecycle planning, security reviews, disaster recovery testing, tabletop exercises for security events, standardization, inventory cleanup, process improvement, strategic planning, preventative maintenance. All the things nobody notices until they don't exist anymore. Reactive work consumes proactive time. And eventually organizations get trapped. Technology teams spend all day solving today's problems and never get enough time to prevent tomorrow's problems. That's how technical debt compounds. That's how environments become dependent on tribal knowledge. And that's how temporary workarounds become permanent architecture. And eventually, the organization becomes one resignation away from discovering how fragile things really are. And that fragility can easily be related to two things that are really impacting K-12 right now, especially in the state of Pennsylvania. It's called business risk and state testing. Now, let's talk a little bit about business risk, because some people hear that phrase and they think, we're a school district, not a corporation. But schools absolutely manage business risk every day. The question is simple. What happens if this system or process or vendor or person fails? Let's use state testing. District with 4,000 students. Most people see testing week and think students log in and they take the test. Technology teams see something very different. Months before that testing begins, they may be updating operating systems, validating testing clients, checking secure browsers, verifying accommodations, testing wireless density, filtering exceptions, confirming the rosters are all correct, staging carts, charging devices, coordinating with those testing coordinators on site, and running even pilot sessions to make sure that everything works the way that it's supposed to. And that's before a single student logs into the system to take the test on test day. When test day starts, technology teams monitor wireless performance, authentication, and device failures. They're running around giving out loaners where devices are broken. They're dealing with vendor outages, and it's what happened with the state of Pennsylvania in DRC this year. The very first day of testing, most of the schools in Pennsylvania couldn't test because we had issues with DRC. Student sessions, they might forget their tickets or might have to reprint. Support requests, escalation procedures, and very nervous teachers, especially if this was your first year running online assessments. Now imagine supporting thousands of simultaneous testing sessions with one network admin, a handful of technicians, and limited redundancy. That's business risk, because the risk isn't simply technology failing. It's the risk the organizational dependency. Too few people understand how everything works. Too much knowledge exists in too few heads, and that's not a tech problem. That's a continuity problem. And continuity is a leadership responsibility. Do you want your results from your test to be impacted by a technology outage? The goal for us as a technology team is to make sure that our systems essentially are invisible. We want technology to get out of the way of learning. But if we don't plan properly, we end up in a position where we could have serious outages that could impact the ability of the students to take the test in a calm and calm manner. And we don't want to have that happen. We never want a teacher to be evaluated on something that happened on test day because a student couldn't log in and they were expected to score advanced on the test, and they get frustrated and their score drops below what they were expecting them to have. It's an extremely stressful position for both the teacher, the leadership, and the technology department to be in. And this addition of online testing has to have us stop and think about another question we need to ask ourselves. Should we continue to support everything we've accumulated? This online testing piece is just another thing that we've added to an already existing portfolio. Should we continue to add things, or do we have to step back a little bit and start to think about, how do we approach all of the systems that we have? Because many technology environments are like storage closets. Nothing ever leaves. Everything stays. Every year, more and more gets added. Another platform, another app, another integration, another dashboard, another vendor, another pilot became permanent. Very few organizations stop and ask, is this still valuable? Does it duplicate another system that we actually have? How many people are using this? What operational burden does it create on not only the IT department, but on the teachers and the administrators? What cybersecurity risk does it introduce if we put this system in? Because especially if it's a SaaS system, remember, a lot of that student data is not within your control anymore. Every system that we add creates operational gravity. Every system requires support, documentation, updates, security reviews, vendor management, troubleshooting, and institutional knowledge. And eventually, complexity grows faster than the capacity that you have on hand. Honestly, it's a lot like investing. If you have an ETF portfolio that has too much overlap and too much sprawl, your returns start to get diluted. You think you've diversified because you feel like you have, but in reality, you're managing unnecessary complexity. Technology environments can work the exact same way. Too many overlapping systems. It dilutes focus, it increases support burden, it creates duplicate workflows, it expands the cybersecurity exposure, it confuses users, and it reduces efficiency. Sprawl kills operational returns. And mature environments aren't built by endlessly adding things. They're built by intentionally deciding what not to support. Because every new platform becomes a long-term operational commitment. At some point, every district has to ask, are we intentionally building an ecosystem, or are we unintentionally building digital hoarding? And I think this is naturally starting to work itself out. It's the infancy of it, but it's going to start happening as parents and administrators and just us as a society start to ask about screen time questions. We're naturally going to parse down all of the things that we have accumulated over the years to be more effective with our screen time as we use them in the classrooms. But it's something that is going to take a lot of focus and a lot of effort, because naturally some teachers do not want to let go of a tool that they've used for years, even though they may be the only one using that tool. And there's really no evidence that it has, improved student outcomes. And in many back rooms, those conversations are starting to happen. Quietly, but they're definitely starting to happen at the board and administrative level. The question isn't always how do we better support technology, because that's not our primary focus in a K-12 institution. It's student outcomes. Sometimes the question has become, how do we reduce technology because supporting it costs too much? And on the surface, that sounds pretty reasonable, because in many cases, we're focused on the bottom line as well as the outcomes. We try to reduce devices, reduce platforms, reduce the support burden, reduce the complexity. But there's an important distinction here. Are we strategically right-sizing technology? Or are we just cutting willy-nilly because this has a price tag that we don't like? Or are we retreating from technology because we never properly supported it in the first place? Those are very different conversations, because right-sizing is extremely healthy. In fact, mature organizations do it all the time. They consolidate, we standardize, they eliminate overlap, they retire underutilized systems, even though some may get upset. We simplify the workloads, and they focus on outcomes instead of tool counts. That's maturity. But sometimes what gets called right sizing is actually something else. Sometimes it's we've built an environment we never properly staffed, governed, or operationally supported. And now we're trying to shrink the problem. That's not strategy, that's reaction. And reaction tends to create its own set of problems. Because if cost becomes the only driver, organizations can accidentally create a different kind of technical debt. Remove a platform without understanding its dependencies, or eliminate a tool without understanding the workflows, and you cut support without understanding the impact, and suddenly you create instructional inconsistency, shadow IT, which is extremely dangerous, manual processes, fragmented workflows, reduced security visibility, and in the end, frustrated users. Then 6 months later, and another product gets purchased to solve the new problem. I've seen it. Any of the tech directors that are out here listening have seen it as well. Add, expand, cut, re-add, repeat. That's not strategy. That's operational whiplash. The goal isn't more technology. The goal isn't less technology either. The goal is the right technology that can actually be sustained and is operationally focused. Now, I apologize because many superintendents or business managers or principals or tech leaders that are out there listening to this podcast right now, your head's probably spinning, especially if this is not your background. You're starting to think, well, that's great, but none of us on our staff really have the knowledge to determine how to help us right-size that system. And that's where managed service providers come in and can actually help. We can run technology audits to essentially help you determine what right size looks like for your school district. And to be clear, technology audits can be extremely valuable, especially if your organization can afford them. A good audit brings in professionals whose entire job is evaluating operational maturity, staffing models, scalability, life cycle planning, cybersecurity posture, organizational risk, and sustainability. And for many superintendents, business managers, and especially technology leaders, that outside perspective can be extremely validating, because maybe you've been saying the same thing for years. Maybe you've been discussing staffing concerns. Maybe you've been raising risk concerns, and maybe you've been explaining technical debt, and suddenly someone from the outside organization says, hey, the exact same thing you've been pushing. Only now it's attached to data, benchmarking, analysis, assessments, and scores. And sometimes leadership hears that differently. That's the value. A good audit gives you your data a voice. It gives your concern structure. It turns opinions into measurable operational findings that are hard to ignore. And for leaders who are excellent operators but less experienced in scaling organizations, audit can provide a roadmap that otherwise might not exist. That's the good side of it. Now let's talk about the other side of it, because audits are frequently sales tools, sometimes intentionally, sometimes subtly. And many organizations performing audits also sell managed services, cybersecurity services, infrastructure, monitoring platforms, co-managed IT, staffing, and outsourcing agreements. So districts need to understand the potential conflict of interest of a good technology audit, because in a lot of cases, it's just a foot inside the door. Because occasionally the conclusion becomes, you have too much complexity, and conveniently, we can manage that for you, or you're understaffed. So outsource more operations to us, or the internal model isn't sustainable, which eventually translates into eliminating internal positions, restructuring departments, and outsourcing portions of the technology operation. Now, to be fair, that doesn't automatically make the recommendations wrong. Sometimes outsourcing is the absolute right answer. Sometimes co-managed support is the healthiest operational decision available. But leadership teams should understand where recommendations originate from, what incentives exist from the people giving those recommendations, and whether proposed solutions align with long-term district goals, your specific goals. Because technology operations aren't just infrastructure. They're relationships, they're institutional knowledge, it's community trust, it's instructional support, it's organizational continuity. And once institutional knowledge leaves the district, rebuilding it can take years. So the healthiest approach is this: use audits as a tool for visibility. Use audits for maturity assessments. Use audits for strategic planning. but don't automatically use them as a justification for replacing the people who have been holding the environment together. So now that we've talked about a technology audit, let's pretend that we've gone through one. And let's say that they've identified risk. Let's address the question everyone asks when we talk about that. Who's to blame? And honestly, most of the time, nobody and everybody all at the same time. School leaders face pressure to, balance taxes, budgets, contracts, academic programs, and community expectations. Tech leaders face something completely different. It's cybersecurity, compliance, support expectations, system growth, vendors, operational continuity. It doesn't mean that either one is right or wrong at this point. The problem isn't usually bad intentions. The problem is that technology is often viewed as support, not infrastructure, and not an integral part of what you're doing as a district. They see devices. They don't see the integrations, the life cycles, the disaster recovery, the identity management, all of the things that you do. And just because they don't see it, it's easy to underestimate the effort required to sustain it. Which brings us to another, uncomfortable truth. Ignoring operational risk usually costs more in the long run, sometimes significantly more, because this technical debt compounds. Burnout compounds, turnover compounds, emergency spending compounds, consulting costs compound, recovery costs compound, and when every experienced staff member leaves, organizations lose more than employees. They lose that institutional knowledge, that historical context, undocumented processes, the relationships, and the operational memory. Then organizations spend years trying to rebuild what already existed. The challenge is that prevention is invisible. Nobody celebrates the outage that never happened, the breach that was prevented, the server replacement that avoided a long-term failure, and the staffing increase that prevented that burnout in the first place. Success often looks like nothing happened, especially in an IT culture. And ironically, that quiet success can convince organizations that additional investment wasn't necessary. Which brings me one of my favorite leadership concepts. There's a Japanese proverb that says, if you realize you're on the wrong train, get off at the next station. The longer you stay on, the more expensive the return trip becomes. And that applies perfectly to technology operations. If you know staffing is unsustainable, the systems are aging, the documentation is weak, the technical debt is growing, and heroics are carrying the operation, waiting rarely makes the problem cheaper. It usually makes it way more expensive, financially, operationally, emotionally. And eventually organizations pay the bill through turnover, outages, emergency projects, cybersecurity incidents, consulting engagements, or just general operational failures. And I know some of this can sound like complaining, especially to the people outside of the technology operations. But this isn't about complaining. It's about trying to prevent the ending before the organization reaches it. The goal here is to maintain a healthy relationship with the technology department and technology operations. So with that said, what does that look like? I mean, healthy doesn't mean perfect. Healthy doesn't mean unlimited budgets. Healthy doesn't mean every request gets approved. Healthy means sustainable. Healthy looks like documentation, cross-training, predictable life cycle planning, realistic project pacing, proactive maintenance, and operational transparency, and a staff member being able to take a vacation without the district falling apart or receiving calls the entire time they're out. That's maturity, not perfection, maturity. And sometimes the most important thing a technology leader can say is, we cannot sustainably support another initiative without additional operational capacity. Now, here's the reality of that. That statement is often met with a lot of resistance. Sometimes it's viewed as negativity. Sometimes it's reviewed as resistance. Sometimes it's interpreted as IT is saying no. But in reality, it's often most responsible thing a leader can say. I've sat in budget meetings where staffing requests were the first things that were cut without really any explanation. not after reviewing the metrics, not after reviewing workload analysis, not after reviewing support ratios, not after reviewing project load. The conversation was simply, we need to hit a budget number. And almost immediately, you're fully staffed. Without truly analyzing workload complexity, risk, sustainability, or operational capacity. And that's where organizations unintentionally create hero cultures, because the work doesn't disappear, the expectations don't disappear, the complexity doesn't disappear, and the same people simply absorb more. And eventually the organization starts bowing itself out on goodwill and exhaustion, until one day it doesn't. Because here's the question leadership teams rarely ask early enough. What happens when the people performing the heroics leave? What happens when that network administrator retires, or the technician resigns, or the director just burns out? The institutional knowledge walks out the door, right? Because heroics aren't infrastructure. They're temporary compensation for infrastructure gaps. And when those people leave, organizations discover the difference between a supported system and a dependent system. And here's the irony. That's often the moment organizations finally decide we probably should have an audit done. Not when the warning signs appeared, not when staffing concerns were raised, not when documentation stopped happening, not when projects stalled, usually after burnout, turnover, incidents, instability, or total failure. By this point, the warning signs have already existed for years. The staff usually knew. Administration usually knew. They were just simply too busy surviving to fully solve the problem. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to take some time just to thank you for sticking with me, because this is one of the longer episodes, but it's extremely important. We want you to think about these last couple things. If your technology department depends on a handful of exhausted people performing daily miracles, you don't have a scalable system. You got survivors. And eventually, survival mode catches up with everybody. The goal isn't to eliminate technology. The goal isn't to buy more technology. The goal isn't even to hire endlessly. The goal is alignment. Alignment between your expectations, your staffing, your complexity, your risk tolerance, your sustainability, and your desired outcomes. Because healthy organizations aren't built on heroics. They're built on systems. They're built on continuity. They're built on operational maturity. And most importantly, they're built so that nobody has to be a superhero in the first place. This has been Chips and Chalk. Real talk, hard lessons, K-12 technology behind the scenes. Thanks for listening. If you're in K-12, whether you're leading it, supporting it, or living it in the classroom, this is the work. If this episode hit home, go ahead and follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if there's something you want us to dig into, or a real-world situation you're working through, we're going to open up that soon. And as we go forward with Chips and Chalk, we're going to keep cutting through the noise. No fluff, no theory without reality, just what actually works in schools. Thanks for listening.